Theresa May is meeting her Brexit cabinet, about a dozen of her most senior ministers, right now to discuss, for the first time, what the UK's future relationship with the EU should be. What kind of reception will she get from the cabinet, which appears to contain some splits on the issue. That is a slight understatement. Let me introduce you to Anushka Asthana, who's the joint political editor of The Guardian. Also Hugh Bennett, deputy editor at Brexit Central and a veteran of the Vote Leave campaign, and Dr Simon Usherwood, who is a politics lecturer and deputy director of UK in a Changing Europe. That's a group of academics who do independent analysis of the UK's relationship with the EU. Anushka, so she has to get her cabinet to agree to a united position. How tricky is that going to be?
Well, I think she won't actually find it that hard to get them to a united position on what should their opening negotiating position be on the final trading outcome, because basically most of the cabinet will swing behind David Davis's Canada plus as he calls it, which is basically a free trade agreement with services and other things added in. So they'll all agree that that's where they should be aiming. There'll be very different opinions on how realistic it is that that's where we will land at the end. And in the meantime, I think there is a real sticking point over the question of transition, because Theresa May and Philip Hammond have basically put out an argument that things will stay the same. You know, so after March 2019, things will ultimately stay the same for 2 years, although we will lose our seat. Michael Gove definitely doesn't agree with that. He thinks there are particular things we need to come out of, things like the fisheries policy during transition, and that might be a sticking point for the discussion today.
And when you say the same, you mean the same rules and regulations that we as a member follow now, and also freedom of movement of people?
Well, so they talk about basically having the same level of market access that we have now. How are you going to achieve that? By following EU rules. On free movement, there will be slight changes. There'll be a registration system, but ultimately they're not going to be bringing in their new immigration system until the end of transition.
Hugh, you probably read Boris Johnson's interview yesterday, where he said what we need to do is something new and ambitious, which this is talking about the trade deal now, which allows zero tariffs and frictionless trade, but still gives us that important freedom to decide our own regulatory framework, our own laws. Can we stay aligned with some bits of the EU and still strike free trade deals with third-party countries?
I think it really depends on the terms of the deal we actually agree. And I think the thing the UK has to be careful about is not actually getting locked into a sort of legally binding treaty which forces alignment on issues. I mean, of course, we're not going to sort of diverge dramatically overnight from EU regulations. I think there's some areas, where the government, as Theresa May actually said in her Florence speech, there's some areas where they think a higher degree of alignment might be better. There are other areas where it's more in our interest to diverge, but I think the key thing is actually not getting locked in, because we do actually get locked in some of these things, particularly when you look at things like agriculture, which is obviously a big part of EU laws, but that's also a very big part of trade deals that are done around the world. If we're bound to follow EU agriculture laws too closely, that will harm our ability to do proper deep and meaningful trade deals with other countries around the world.
OK. And if you diverge totally, if Britain diverged totally, Simon, would Brussels then impose tariffs and other barriers?
Well, the question is the degree of divergence and, again, the framework that you've got, that the EU would like to keep as close an alignment as there is. But if you have any divergence, then potentially that raises the question of what sanctions or penalties the EU might impose. So you have a real tension here between wanting to have some flexibility but also not wanting to impose barriers with your existing relations. So the balance of that, I think, is something that still isn't really clear how you make that work on either side, that both sides say they want to have this good relationship, a close relationship, but how you make that work in practice, I think, really isn't clear yet.
And what's the reaction to the EU's chief negotiator on Brexit, Michel Barnier, saying in an interview, there's not going to be any bespoke deal for Britain, which is clearly what Britain wants? Well,
I mean, the reaction at the moment to anything like that is, hang on, that's their negotiating position. We've got our negotiating position. We don't assume that is the outcome. But a lot of experts would say, who knew that we were going to be talking about regulatory alignment for a couple of years, but a lot of experts would say that it is going to be quite hard to break away from a bespoke deal. In which case, in 2 years' time, the question might be, do we want to have a kind of Norway-style economy, or do we want to have a Canada-style economy? And when you get to that point, then there are real divisions between people, not just across Parliament, but within the Conservative Party.
What do you think the next 2 years is going to be like? or slightly less than 2 years, but until March 2019.
Yeah, well,
it's going to feel like 10 years, isn't it?
I think, yeah, judging from the negotiations so far, it's definitely going to feel like there's a lot going on. But I think that the next key battle is obviously going to be over transition. I think that's what the EU said it wants to talk about next. Obviously, so May's got, she's got competing interests. I think Brexiteers are understandably uncomfortable about the idea that transition is just going to be, a really maximal transition. It's going to be staying in the customs union, staying in the single market,
yeah?
even though May says it won't be in name. I mean, I think it's obviously it's not ideal, but I think it does look like the route we're probably going to go down. So I think the most important thing for May is actually to secure some of these concessions that she's talking about, and we're expecting her to talk about later today in the Commons, actually securing the ability for Britain to sign trade deals during this period. And other things probably, as Michael Gove wants, coming out of the common fisheries policy. And I think, we may not be able to get a different agreement on the overall architecture of the transition period, but I think to actually, to withdraw from some things that aren't essential to maintaining frictionless trade in the transition period, I think is probably the right approach.
I think the question about being able to sign free trade deals with other countries, I think, might be symbolic rather than substantive, because these deals are going to be very complicated. A lot of other countries aren't going to want to conclude a deal until they know what the UK's relationship with the EU is, that this clearly is going to be a key factor. So I think we're going to see a lot of debate in the remainder of these negotiations about what is actually meaningful and what might be more just about things to take home and show that we've won a victory in the negotiations. So there's a lot that's still on the table, despite what we've already had agreed last week.
Okay. Thank you all. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming in. Appreciate it.